My name is Jeff Resnick. I'm Chief of the History of Medicine Division at the National Library of Medicine. Thank you all for joining us today for the 5th Annual NLM Michael E. DeBakey Lecture in the History of Medicine. And to those of you who are following along on Twitter, thanks very much using the hashtag NLMHistTalk. This event is part of the NLM's 2021 History Talks, an annual series designed to promote awareness and use of NLM historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. The series also supports the commitment of the NLM to recognize the diversity of its collections, which span 10 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the globe. Moreover, the series aims to appreciate the diversity of individuals of various disciplines who value these collections and use them to advance their research, their teaching, and their learning. Today's program, like all of our lectures, is being live streamed globally and subsequently will be archived by NIH videocasting, both of these efforts being made possible by a generous gift to the National Library of Medicine by the Michael E. DeBakey Medical Foundation. And it is that gift which in 2016 helped our institution to establish the NLM Michael E. DeBakey Fellowship in the History of Medicine. The fellowship provides up to $10,000 to support research in the historical collections of the National Library of Medicine, which include the papers of Dr. Michael E. DeBakey, reflecting the diverse areas in which he made a lasting impact as a legendary surgeon, educator, medical statesman, from the areas of surgery, of course, to medical education and healthcare policy, and much more. Earlier this month, the NLM released its call for fellowship applications for 2022. If you're interested to apply, please visit the website of the History of Medicine Division for complete details. That site is www.nlm.gov/HMD. Applications are due on September 30th, 2021. It is my distinct pleasure and privilege today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Allison Hill Edgar, an artist and doctor, an independent scholar affiliated with the New York Academy of Art and the Fenimore Art Museum. She joins us today to share early outcomes of her research as one of our 2020 DeBakey Fellows in the History of Medicine. A native of Washington, D.C., Dr. Hill Edgar, again, is a doctor and visual artist who works in New York City. Her body of work focuses on the human form and seeks to explore and analyze the human experience. In particular, she investigates the often complicated relationship between the understanding of one's internal world, both physical and mental, and one's external reality. Dr. Hill Edgar is a graduate of Harvard College, where she majored in fine arts. And during her time in college, she also worked for Art Education for the Blind in New York City and the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. Following college, she took a postgraduate year in Paris to study art history, photography, and figure drawing. Although studio art has been her enduring passion, Dr. Hill Edgar also has pursued a fascination with the human body from a scientific perspective. She earned her MD from Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons in 2003, and she completed her medical internship at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital and obtained her medical license in 2004. During the period in which she studied medicine, she complemented her medical work with life drawing classes, photography, and the study of the history of anatomy and art. In 2004, Dr. Hill Edgar decided to return to a full-time career as an artist. In addition, she earned her master's in fine arts from the New York Academy of Art in 2017, and she is currently painting, exhibiting, and teaching in New York. Her work has been exhibited in galleries and museums in the New York City area, and her work is also in private collections in New York City, Washington, D.C., Charleston, South Carolina, upstate New York, Connecticut, Maine, California, and Holland. As a doctor and artist, Dr. Hill Edgar's combination of these two fields of study has given her a unique understanding of the human form and functions. It is this melding of art, science, and consideration of the human condition that drives much of her creative endeavor today and informs her research in the vast collections of the National Library of Medicine, initial results of which she'll be sharing with us this afternoon in her presentation entitled Dissecting Gender, Reframing Anatomical History Through the Female Body. Dr. Hill Edgar, welcome, and thank you in advance for what is going to be a great presentation. Look forward to it.
Thank you, Dr. Resnick. I appreciate both the opportunity for the fellowship from you and especially from the DeBakey Foundation and the chance to speak today. I'd also like to thank Dr. Stephen Greenberg and the rest of the NLM library staff who made the times I was able to visit before COVID a true joy. They were so helpful, as well as Ken Coyle, Rebecca Warlow, Elizabeth Mullen, and Lindsay France. I'm grateful to the DeBakey Fellowship in particular for embracing this project. It combines art and medicine, that as you explained has been my enduring interest, but in a fairly non-traditional way. One that I believe offers great insight into both the past and current medical issues. Michael DeBakey, as you know, was a vascular and cardiac surgeon, but I believe there was much artistry in his practice. As a child, he loved to sew, a skill that certainly contributed to his surgical skills later in life. And no doubt it takes a creative mind and a knowledge of how to manipulate various materials to invent and successfully implement new procedures and devices. The intersection of art and medicine has always been of great interest to me. I was fortunate to have the opportunity as a fourth-year medical student at Columbia to do an elective in which I researched a notebook, a student notebook from 1872 that's at the Columbia Medical Library Archives and Special Collections. Since medical school, I've continued to research anatomical history, as well as contemporary artists who approach the body and anatomy from a creative perspective. The study not only has influenced my own creative work, but also has encouraged me to constantly reevaluate my approach to the human body, in particular when I'm dealing with the female body. But I also believe that applying a creative eye and visual analysis to medical documents helps to reveal how medical concepts developed and were imparted to both physicians and society. The more anatomical images I researched, the more I began to realize that they were predominantly male bodies, especially those images that circulated into the general public. I was curious, were women's bodies a part of the canon of anatomical history? And if so, in what context? So I decided to go back to the library at the New York Academy of Medicine, where I had done a lot of my research in med school. And luckily for me, the wonderful librarian, Arlene Shaner, remembered me from 17 years before, and she helped guide me on my deep dive into this amazing topic. It quickly became clear that although women's bodies have definitely been a part of anatomical history from its inception, it was usually as the reproductive other body to the neutral male body. While this history of anatomy is well documented, I wanted to revisit it with the female body as the primary subject. What became clear is that there's so much more to her story. It's elaborate, it's filled with visual treasures, it's fascinating personalities, and lots of historical moments. As I say to all my friends, this has been the project that keeps on giving. While this talk will only cover a small portion of my research, I hope to give you an overview of some of the issues that I've been investigating and show how the anatomical history of women's bodies, the often marginalized or other part of the binary, can give us insights into how a more diverse group of bodies have been treated for their difference. Western art and medicine share an interdependent history. Not only did they share the same patron saint, St. Luke, who is here in this picture, but they were also part of the same guild in Florence in the early Renaissance. This painting captures so much of the original origins of anatomy. You see in the background, there are classical sculptures showing the reliance on classical forms. And in the foreground at Mary's feet, there's a text by Galen with added anatomical drawings. Also, you see there's the influence of Christianity, as well as the importance of the mother as the reproductive body in this painting. This is truly a collaboration of art and medicine. As anatomy shifted from being a textual practice that was handed down from the ancients to a modern one that stressed observation, direct observation, it required a visual form of communication to record these observations. I also want to focus on the issue of gender that's in anatomical images. Until the 20th century, issues of sex, gender, gender identity, and sexual preference were all generally considered to be uniformly aligned and were categorized into a binary of male and female. Although history is full of cases that did not conform to these divisions, they were still considered aberrations from the norm. In this image of Adam and Eve, you see the original Christian binary couple taking an apple from a tree in the form of a skeleton, the symbol of mortality. The anatomist is informing the viewer that they will learn the lessons of life from this anatomical book, just the way Adam and Eve did from the Garden of Eden. Throughout this talk, I'm going to refer to the WHO's definition of sex as, quote, the biological and physiological characteristics that define men and women, and gender as, quote, the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for men and women. Even within biological sex, there are many factors that influences one's physiological presentation, such as a person's genetic makeup, intrauterine development, hormonal production, and puberty. As a result, there's great variety in how a person can present, whether at the extremities in male and female or somewhere in between as intersex. This is an image of John Blunt, a man midwife, and it gives a good example of how one defined gender in 1793. During this time, there was an intense controversy between midwives and medical men, both of whom were vying for the exclusive right to deliver babies. But only men were allowed to get a medical education, and only men were allowed to use tools like forceps. This particular individual dressed up as either a man or a woman, depending on the circumstances of the birth they were attending. While here in this case, you can see the sex was still the same, he altered his gender presentation to navigate society's norms and expectations. One thing is for sure, what we normally see in anatomical history is the tip of the iceberg. There's no better place to dive into what's been written and illustrated than at the National Library of Medicine, which has the largest collection of medical resources in the world. I'd like to illustrate an example of how exciting this type of research can be. One day, I was working through the obstetric atlases of the most famous 18th century man midwives, shown here, William Hunter, William Smellie, and Charles Nicholas Genty. Hunter on the left felt that anatomy had to represent exactly what you saw. And as you can see from these illustrations, he did not shy away from details, even the butchered appearance of a woman's body. In the middle is Smellie's A Set of Anatomical Tables, which was actually the first illustrated medical book published in the United States. And on the right is probably the least known of the three. That's Genty, who was a French surgeon, and not much is known about him, nor are there that many of his works that remain. But in the back of one of his atlases, I found this. These are two plates entitled, in English, Boy Hermaphrodite, seen in 1755, and Girl Hermaphrodite, seen in 1751, both drawn from life. These plates were definitely not by Genty, nor were they intended to be issued with his work, but they somehow found their way into this volume. Hermaphrodite was the term once used to describe intersex individuals. And at the bottom, there's a little handwritten note added later that explains the origins. There are a couple of things that I find very interesting about these images. They're unusual in their content, and they're not obstetrical. So I was sort of curious, why would they be contained within this volume? I believe the reasons for that are twofold. For one, any physical presentation outside of the norm was considered an aberration of gestation, and that was usually associated with the female body. Secondly, any non-normative body would have been associated with the binary other, the woman, certainly not the universal man. This is probably one of the most recognizable images in all of art history. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, which is also called the universal man. This powerful exemplar of the human race defines the ideal, the person at one with math, science, the universe, and God. But in doing so, he also defines the other, the person that's not the ideal, which by default is anyone who's not male, white, young, perfectly proportioned, fit, and without any hair on his body except for his wonderful head. I recently came across this image on social media, and I liked the message. Basically, that deep inside of us, there's a common humanity and differences such as race, sexual orientation, religion, or piratehood, which I guess is mentioning one's occupation, they don't change very much that shared core. But as I pointed out to the person who posted this image, there are no women here. Even in a message of inclusivity, the skeletons are all male. I don't believe the intention was to exclude women. I actually think most people don't know the differences between a male and female skeleton. But for the most part, that's because for the most part, we're provided with one consistent default image of the body, and that's male. On a practical level, it's also much easier and cheaper to buy a male skeleton. As an artist who focuses on the female body, I was looking to purchase one online to use as a reference. This is what I found. Classic human, painted human, premium lifetime human, highly flexible human, deluxe superhuman, miniature human. They're all male, and in the fine print, they use the term he, the classic human. But if you keep searching, you eventually find a female skeleton. Not only is she hard to find, but take note of her price. This is the cheapest female you could get. The cheapest male made by a different company was $189. Then that little box popped up on the bottom, welcoming me to their site and asking if they could help me. Well, they could. I'll spare you the extensive conversation that made its way all the way to management, but the result of it was that they offered me a male skeleton with a female pelvic bone and skull for a reduced price. I informed them that that was a standard trope going back to the Enlightenment, when the female skull and pelvic measurements were used to restrict a woman's role to the home and reduce her voice in government. at which point they offered me both the premium female and a disarticulated female for a reduced price, and that was an offer I couldn't refuse. We had a good debate about supply and demand, and I pointed out that when the male model was called the norm and the female model was priced so high and buried so deep, it was very hard to decide what was really demand. To quote Londa Scheibinger, who has written extensively about the history of the female skeleton and skeletons in the closet, quote, "The measurement of the distinguishing characteristics of the skeleton, the skull and pelvis, led some anatomists to conclude that white women ranked below European men." She continued, "In terms of both physical and social development, these anatomists classified women with children and primitive peoples. Stated in a different way, cultural ideals masqueraded as the facts of nature, which in turn served as a basis for social inequality. This was true for both women and enslaved Africans." For example, many studies have shown that medical textbooks, both past and present, are full of visual gender bias. For example, in Grey's Anatomy, only around 11% of the non-urogenital images were female. This trend was seen in a wider sample of textbooks as well. In 2018, a study by Parker further showed that gender bias in medical images had a direct effect on students' implicit gender attitudes. The logic for including or excluding the female body has been variable over time. This can be seen not just in skeletons and textbooks, but in real-world examples that affect our lives. Researchers have often defended the exclusion of women from studies, claiming that their hormonal cycles make them too biologically heterogeneous, both from men and from each other. To quote the authors of a great book, Outrageous Practices, quote, "It defies logic for researchers to acknowledge gender difference by claiming women's hormones can affect study results, for instance, by affecting drug metabolism, but then to ignore those differences, study only men, and extrapolate those results to women." While drug studies began to look at sex as a factor, when they did, 8 out of 10 prescription drugs were pulled off the market between 1997 and 2001, and they were done so because they were found to have negative effects on women. Similarly, the Toyota Sienna is known to have one of the highest safety ratings. When the US finally introduced a female crash test dummy in 2011, the passenger seat went from having a rating of 5 to a rating of 2. Apparently, they didn't even test women drivers in the driver's seat because the assumption was the driver would be male. NIH began to directly address these issues in the 1990s when it launched the Women's Health Initiative and formed the Office of Research on Women's Health to improve women's inclusion as research subjects and coordinate research on women's issues. In 1993, the NIH Revitalization Act became law, which mandated the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research funded by the NIH. While in the last decade, there have been great increased efforts to improve the inclusion of women in studies, the World Economic Forum just in 2020 estimated that the global gender gap will take about 99 years to close. Now I want to give you a brief overview of the anatomical representation of female bodies throughout history along these 4 major themes. First is the female cadaver. This image is from a 15th century book based on a 13th century text that was a popular encyclopedia in the Middle Ages, and it's clearly an example of the gender bias found in anatomical representation. Depicted here is the Christian story of origins entitled The Creation of Eve and the Structure of Man, in which Eve rises out of Adam's rib to embrace God, and all the while is encircled in the Garden of Eden. In the foreground, standing freely, fully engaging with the landscape, is man, revealing his anatomized torso in full frontal view. This image clearly shows that a woman's body and creation itself are part of a prescribed symbolic and allegorical world, whereas man's body is part of the earthly realm. He is a fact of nature, and therefore he's appropriate for scientific study. That dichotomy, as well as the hierarchical order of man first, woman second, has been present in anatomy and medicine since its beginning and remains in various forms today. It's not that women's bodies weren't dissected, they were, but they were under slightly different circumstances. From the Renaissance until about the 20th century, most cadavers were executed criminals, sometimes unclaimed bodies, the indigent, victims of grave robbings, and occasionally victims of murder. It was not until the 20th century that voluntary bodily donations became common. When it came to dissecting women's bodies, there were few available, not only because there were fewer female criminals, but also because they couldn't be executed while pregnant. These factors made the female body quite prized. But there were other ways people could gain access to the interior of women's bodies. Perhaps the most common one that we all know is the C-section. While many believed it was named after Julius Caesar because it goes back to that time, it was not. He references his mother later in life, and there's no way she would have survived. According to mythology, the Greek demigod of medicine, Asclepius, was also born by C-section. And then there's Nero, who always manages to find his way into stories, who supposedly poisoned his mother and then watched her autopsy. Catherine Park has described in The Secrets of Women other reasons women were dissected in the Middle Ages, such as in the unusual case of a 13th century abbess, Chiara de Montefalco, who was dissected to verify her claim that the stigmata of Christ were in her body. The image on the right is one of the earliest pictures representing the actual process of postmortem dissection, and it's of a woman. From the surprised look on the face of the dissector, who has both knife and liver in hand, and the admonishing gesture of the physician who just walked in, it looks as though he was caught in the act of doing something he wasn't supposed to do. I'd now like to discuss the extensive history of the anatomical female as a reproductive body. As I mentioned previously, the female body is most commonly represented as the reproductive other to the universal man, a role that became her most defining characteristic, medical significance, and purpose. The most frequent representation of pregnancy in medieval times and in early modern Christian art was the Virgin Mary, seen in the middle, with a tiny baby Jesus. While not medical, her pervasive image as holy, pure, youthful, and pregnant profoundly influenced accepted modes of representing women. On the left is an illustration of the terrifying extremes of fecundity. In the margins of this Albertus Magnus manuscript, someone has drawn a few multiparous women, with one of them having up to 28 babies. On the right, it's an image from around 1300, and it shows the central importance of her reproductive capacity. In fact, her only organ shown is her uterus. If you're curious about the shape of her uterus, it illustrates the early concept of uterine structure, established in ancient times and passed down until the Renaissance. According to this theory, the uterus had 7 cells or compartments that accommodated not only multiple births, but also determined the sex of the child. There were 3 for women, 3 for men, and 1 for intersex. Both pictures on the left, the one above and below each other, demonstrate that 7-celled uterus. The middle one is the 13th century that imagines the uterus and related structures as a crucifix. And then on the right is a woodblock print from 1523 that, as opposed to the previous examples that were very much based on symbolism, this was one where the anatomist Berengario de Carpi dissected actual uteri and realized that they only had 1 compartment and they were receptive to any sex. This series of images at the National Library are by Mansur ibn Ilyas, a Persian scholar and physician. They're from 1485, and they're the earliest Islamic versions of this type, but they likely have an ancient origin in Alexandria, since similar forms show up in both Europe and Persia. Traditionally, these are a 5-figure series, but this Ibn Ilyas has added a 6th figure, which you can see on the right, of a pregnant woman. It's basically the same as the arterial figure, only he's added an oval gravid uterus. As you can see, these are conceptual. They're quite reductive and schematic. You wouldn't want to do surgery from these images, but it does give a slight indication of where organs were placed in the body. The only indication of sex difference here is the uterus, and there is no indication of any gender differences. There are neutral bodies. In the 15th century, the field of anatomy began to change rapidly. Anatomical dissection and direct observation were now part of the medical teaching practice, and illustrations, here in the form of woodblock prints, were essential. Shown in these works are Johannes de Kethem, his 1491 work, which was the first printed medical textbook with illustrations. 3 years later, he revised some of these images and reprinted it in Italian to reach a broader audience. At the left is the frontispiece, and here you can see what the traditional anatomical theater would have looked like. It was both all male and rigidly hierarchical, with the professor at the top, the medical students below that, the surgeon, and then the cadaver. At the right is a sickness figure, in which named different parts of the body, as well as different possible maladies, and it was related, all of these were related to the structure of the male body. But he also included, both in his 1491 and 1494 edition, female figures. In the earlier edition on the left, her body still in a posture recalling the Ibn Ilyas images, though her gender is now indicated by both her hair and her headdress. Although many of the organs are labeled with lists of potential illnesses for each, the text only discusses her reproductive system. In the 94 edition on the right, this was seen as a great advancement in the understanding and representation of anatomy. And while there's a greater attempt to situate her organs in locations that they were more likely to be found, and they also put her in an armchair, her internal anatomy has been reduced to only her urogenital organs. Catham's book was known to be in the collection of Leonardo da Vinci. On the left, you can see that he copied his full figure, his sickness figure, but he's also included the organs inside. At the same time that he was doing this, he was also trying to teach himself Latin, medicine, and anatomy. On the right is a drawing from about 25 years later in 1510, which is one of the most iconic of all Renaissance drawings, and it's definitely the most complete study that Leonardo did of the internal organs. While there are many inaccuracies, including a 7-celled interior uterine outline, it's a far cry from what his contemporaries were doing. Furthermore, it's one of the only examples that I found where the female body is used as the normative body. Interestingly, however, in more modern books, the image is often categorized within the female genitourinary system. Leonardo was also interested in female reproductive anatomy and the mechanics of both reproduction and gestation. In 1508, he made one of the first anatomical illustrations of female genitalia based on actual dissections, and he was the first person to correctly draw the uterine artery and the vascular system of the cervix and vagina. While he occasionally conflated bovine and botanical parts with human anatomy, he is considered the first person to correctly depict at the right the human fetus in its proper position within the womb, and by drawing the womb with only one compartment. In addition to their form and function, Leonardo was also fascinated by the complex life of humans and their connection to nature and to God. This is a bit of detour from the women's reproductive body, but it's a significant painting in terms of how both sex and gender were portrayed. This is St. John the Baptist, who was probably completed between 1513 and 1516, and it's believed to be his final painting. It was with him when he died. In it, Leonardo creates a mysterious and androgynous portrayal of St. John that's sort of an intermediary between man and God, the sensual and the spiritual, male and female. Evidence for this non-binary thinking can be seen in a drawing from his studio or the St. John. Not much is known about this image, or even if it's by his hand, but it gives you insights into the creative space that Leonardo occupied. For him, the melding of the sexes was associated with godliness, not dysfunction. Leonardo's thinking and skill were truly unusual in many ways. This is an image from about 20 years after Leonardo died. These are part of a series of illustration called flat books. They're also called fugitive sheets, which are also loose sheets, in which layers could be cut out and assembled like paper dolls. These flat books typically depicted both the male and female as companions. This work is by Johann Remelin from about 80 years later, 1619. In it, you can see that the level of detail and intricacy has jumped tremendously during this time. On the right, you can see an example of one of the flaps being pulled up. The act of pulling back each layer was sort of analogous to the act of dissection itself. In this illustration, not only does he show the male and female companion figures, but if you look at the bottom in the middle, you can see that there's a huge torso of a pregnant woman. This feature highlights the centrality of female reproduction to anatomy. When you open the pregnant abdomen, you're confronted with a Medusa-type ogre, or diabole, as is written on the image. And this was thought to maybe warn of the proximity of evil in all of God's handiwork. Under that flap, you will eventually work your way to the baby and then to the back of the uterus. Jumping several centuries, I want to show you this wonderful example of a very large 19th century mannequin that's at the National Library of Medicine. It's called White's Physiological Mannequin. You can see by the comparison to the chair on the right how big it is. This figure is clearly male, and it's being used here as the universal body. But when you start to open the flaps, you discover that there's only one reproductive system, and that's of a woman. Complete with external genitalia, shown in cross-section, which you can see on the left. Another feature that was interesting about this flap book is that when you open up the rib cage, You're presented with an illustration of the damaging effects of corseting, which was a significant health concern for women at this time. While these female references can make a very compelling example of a 19th century intersex or transgender individual, I don't think that that was the intent. What it does show is very clearly here that the male body served as the norm for all but one aspect, and the female body was significant only for her reproductive capacity and her dangerous fashion choices. Also in the collection of the National Library is this 1905 anatomical mannequin that's solely devoted to showing a woman's body, both pregnant and non-pregnant. Of note, it was revised by a female doctor, Dr. Ethel Mayer. Whereas the flat books and loose sheets were conceived to be useful to a broad audience, such as doctors, medical students, surgeons, and the general public, printed anatomical books were geared more towards a more medical audience. Again, you often see the initial companion pair, but in this format, the man tends to be broadly dissected, as you can see here, and the woman is only partially dissected to show her urogenital organs. You also begin to see a gendering of their respective worlds. For example, men tend to be active, engaging with the landscape, and even sometimes participating in their own dissection. Women, however, are generally shown in interior settings where they're cloaked. They're typically seated down and they're passive, modest, if not shameful. Furthermore, they're only shown for their reproductive organs. I'm particularly fond of the one on the right, where she's taking a more active role in pointing at her placenta, as if she's showing us a new truth about the female body. 1543 was a significant turning point in the history of anatomy. It's the year that Andreas Vesalius published his famous work, the Fabrica, and he changed the nature of anatomy and anatomical illustration in Europe. Not only did he perform his own dissections and record them in great detail, but also he was the first person to openly refute many of Galen's anatomical and physiological principles. Furthermore, the woodblock prints by Jan de Kelkar were the most detailed, informative, and artistically advanced to date. With the publication of this book, which could now be done by the printing press, the pursuit of anatomy exploded. There's a couple things I want to point out in this image. First of all, note the shift of the anatomist from the position on high as the professor to being right next to the cadaver, both teaching and observing directly. Surrounding all of this is a throng of students, onlookers. There are some dogs and monkeys, but in the center of all this chaos is the main event, the main focus, the cadaver. And quite remarkably, it's a woman. This was not by chance. Vesalius was proud that he had dissected 12 women. As I mentioned, female cadavers were not only more difficult to come by, but they were also prized because they embodied the secrets of life through their generative anatomy. While it is significant that the female body is the focus of the image, and it's wonderful that she's being so highly valued, there's also something I find quite unsettling about this picture. She's the only woman in this boisterous crowd, she's naked, and her body is open and available for examination. Actually, she is not the only woman in the room. There's another woman hiding in the back. So the story goes, the cadaver was a criminal, and before she could be executed and dissected, a midwife had to verify that she was not pregnant. It's believed that this figure is the midwife who sealed her fate. Vesalius's Fabrica is best known for the iconic, exquisite, and accurately detailed muscle men and skeletons. They look alive in death, and they're a celebration of man's majesty and spirit. But when he demonstrates the internal organs in situ, he often situates them in famous ancient sculptures, making the naked bodies both acceptable and historically and artistically significant. There are only 2 torsos of women in the entire book, both showing the urogenital organs. And this one, she's presented in the body of a sculpture of Venus de Milo, the goddess of love and beauty. The Fabrica reveals another important example about how sex and gender were framed during this time. If you look at a picture of the genitals, we all know what this is, a vagina. If you're like me, you probably thought that this was part of the male anatomy when you first saw it. But no, this is his illustration of a vagina. While there are many theories about why Vesalius drew it this way, including a story about a hasty grave robbery in which a monk's dead mistress was taken out of the ground and they had to quickly cut out her reproductive organs, it more likely is a direct representation of the long-standing philosophy handed down from the ancients that women's organs were homologues through inversion of men's. Thus, the vagina was like a penis turned inside the body, the ovaries were testes, etc. Furthermore, the ancient theories assigned a hierarchy to these differences, with women's organs being some kind of incomplete version of men's, or an inferior realization. So while Vesalius debunked many of the anatomical notions of the ancients, and he touted the importance of dissecting women and also direct observation, he still allowed traditional sex and gender-based theories to dictate his representation. I want to show you a few other examples of some of the really exquisite and beautiful images of women's bodies as reproductive bodies. This is Spiegel's Formation of the Fetus from 1626, which focuses on fetal development. In it, you see these women who are depicted as the four seasons with wombs that unfold like flowers. One of the most intriguing anatomists, he was actually more artist than anatomist, was Jacques-Fabien Gauthier d'Agoty. His images are memorable and sometimes haunting, occasionally humorous. As you can see from this image on the left, which is of a male body, he was compared to the ones on the right, he was really much more interested and intrigued by the female body. The females are often illustrated as two figures, a more lifelike and highly gendered woman with facial expressions, hairstyles, gestures, both maternal and dramatic, and another woman who's more cadaver-like, sexual, and monstrous. At their feet are dissected genital organs, the fetuses, placentas, and occasionally a floating embryonic homunculus in a little glass. And just to show you that anatomy is live and well in contemporary art, here are two installations by Damien Hirst. These works are massive examples of both the full pregnancy figure and an isolated uterus. The sculpture on the left is called the Virgin Mother. It's based on Degas' sculpture of the little dancer of 14 years, only this one is pregnant, half dissected, and 33.5 feet tall. The 216-ton installation on the right is called the Miraculous Journey, and it's in Qatar, outside the Sidra Medical and Research Center. It supposedly is the first naked sculpture in the Middle East, and it's caused quite a controversy. It follows an embryo's development from sperm to fetus to birth baby boy. I now want to focus on that second form of symbolic reproductive body, the isolated uterus. Up until the beginning of the 20th century, live fetuses in utero couldn't be visualized. Thus, the images of the intrauterine environment were created both for the practical purpose of teaching people how to deliver babies, but also for the philosophical one of trying to explain the origins of life. You can see there's a common pattern of this flask-like uterus with different potential presentations at birth. Just as the image of the pregnant woman has changed with time, technology, and worldviews, so has the fetal image in utero. But one thing has remained fairly constant. Just like the universal human is typically male, so too is the universal baby. These are some of the only examples of female babies that I've come across. The irony of the universal male baby is that in fetal development, if androgens aren't present, the female genitalia will be phenotypically female. Before the 18th century, most births took place at home with female friends and family, and usually a midwife who offered expertise and guidance. Occasionally, male surgeons were brought in an emergency, either to save the life of the mother by extracting the baby, or to save the life of the baby if the mother had died. They had a terrible reputation with the midwives, who would do anything to deliver the baby before calling on a surgeon. And conversely, the surgeons had a terrible view of the midwives. In the 17th century, Peter Chamberlain the Elder allegedly invented forceps, and by the 18th century, they were being used all over Europe. You can see them in the center picture. Since it was illegal for female midwives to use them, men gradually started to take over the practice and profession of midwifery. The pictures in the middle and the right are by William Smellie, who I mentioned earlier. He was probably the most significant obstetrician by the mid-18th century and was considered a great teacher, but he was not entirely liked by the midwives. In fact, Elizabeth Neal, a midwife and feminist from the time, described him as, quote, a great horse god mother of a he midwife. These are some of the most famous midwives leading up to that period. They often served as court and royal midwives, delivering many of the rulers of Europe. They sought to dispel myths about pregnancy and childbirth, often attributed to the ancients, such as the idea of women's genitals being inverted homologues of men's. They emphasized the role of the woman in conception. They fought for more social and political equality. They argued that one couldn't learn anything from women about books because they had been written by men. And of course, they were sometimes accused of witchcraft. There's one 18th century French midwife who I'd love to discuss in more detail. because she's one of the most interesting people I came across in my research. This is Marguerite Angelique Laboursier de Courdray. Historian Nina Ratner-Gelbart has written a fantastic book about her life called The King's Midwife. Amidst all of the upheaval of men trying to take over the practice of midwifery mid-century, she decided to recreate herself at the age of 45. She began calling herself Madame, even though she wasn't married, and embarked on a mission to promote her career and status working within the patriarchy, rather than engaging in feminist advocacy work of her fellow midwives. She published a book seen here called The Abrégé, and it was a practical how-to manual on how to deliver children, in which she posits herself as a dedicated servant of the state, stressing the importance of safe pregnancy and delivery for the benefit of the French national population. Not long after publishing this book, King Louis XV gave her the special task of traveling throughout France under both his patronage and protection to share her expertise. This was almost unheard of for a woman of that time. And of note, to American history, she delivered the Marquis de Lafayette. You can see in her illustrations, her main focus was the delivery of the baby, who not surprisingly is a male baby, a proper citizen of France. When the Parliament of Paris ruled in 1755 that midwives couldn't use forceps, she decided to create the first life-sized obstetrical mannequin, which she called her machine. She could use it in her classes and believed it would properly train midwives, so forceps would be unnecessary. Her model contains a womb, vagina, bladder, rectum, and ligaments, as well as a child with flexible joints. There's a child's head with overlapping cranial bones, a placenta with membranes, a set of twins with membranes, an umbilical cord with 2 arteries and a vein, one half of which is withered to imitate that of a dead child, and the other half, which was inflated and could simulate beating vessels to imitate that of an alive child. She also included a non-gravid uterus and a pessary to practice placement. Apparently, at some point, she also introduced different fluids that you could buy for extra money. This is an X-ray of her machine, and you can see from it that she's used an actual female pelvic bone and constructed joints. She supposedly made over 600 of these in her lifetime, though only one remains in Rouen. For comparison, this is another mannequin in the same museum adjacent to hers. It was made 100 years later by 2 men, and it was one of the most popular models on the market. As you can see, it offers less details, and the materials, which are wood, metal, with some leather, are a far cry from some of the tissues of the body. I would say that that gaping metallic ring of a vagina offers little in the way of actual experience of the delivery. While both models are objectifying and impersonal, I do think it's interesting to contrast the similar items made by a woman who is teaching primarily women and men teaching mostly men. But what really stood out to me in particular was that this was a baby girl. Given that all of de Courdray's books illustrate a male baby, it's fascinating to me that in this case, she deviates from the standard. This careful and time-consuming stitching, I think, makes it clear that this was a conscious choice on her part. While I can only speculate on the reasoning for this, I like to believe that when she was in her actual classes with female students, she felt at liberty to include a girl model. Jumping ahead 200 centuries, when new imaging technologies were developed, you could now see the interior of living bodies. In the early 1920s, X-rays were used until the harmful effects were discovered. And then in 1958, ultrasounds became the gold standard for fetal imaging. Medically, these new technologies revolutionized maternal and fetal care. Socially, it also created the most recognizable fetal image, what's called the fetal portrait, that's now distributed in ads, Christmas cards, throughout social media. And politically, it's been used by the Right to Life movement for political and legislative action. In many ways, it's our contribution, floating little man in the uterus. To quote historian Margaret Carlyle, such visuals presenting fetal independence did so at the expense of maternal embodiment. In the 1960s and 70s, this isolated little hero rose to stardom when photographs of fetuses started appearing on magazine covers. And this sparked a new fascination, both within medicine and the general public, with embryology. But at the same time, it began to stoke fears about the futuristic power of laboratory-based reproduction, as well as demise of the traditional family. This famous Life cover from 1965 features Lennart Nilsson's photos of a fetus, along with a story about human development. 8 million copies sold within the first 4 days of release. While this article claims that the photos were of living fetuses, Nilsson actually photographed aborted material obtained from Swedish women who had legally terminated their pregnancies. As a result, he was able to compose the photos with special lighting, backgrounds, and different positions, such as putting the thumb of the fetus's hand in its mouth to make it look more alive. In all of the images, the presence of the mother has been eradicated, thus minimizing her vital role as well as the fetus's dependence upon her. These images continue to have a profound impact on popular culture, most notably in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. The free-floating star child represents the next step in human evolution. Stanley Kubrick makes the eradication of the mother complete. Not only is the baby spontaneously born from the main character, who's a male after he dies, but also the actual baby model, which was made by a woman that was used in the film, she was never given credit in the final credits of the film. Her name is Liz Moore. This is a time cover from 1978, which marked the birth of the first test tube baby, Louise Brown. Despite the fact that she came from both female and male parents, the image shows two silvery, like sort of space-age figures reaching out to create life. The gesture is a direct quote from Michelangelo's Sistine Ceiling, seen on the right, in which God touches the outstretched finger of Adam to create human life, thus driving home the message that just as with divine creation in the beginning, in scientific creation in the future, the woman won't be involved. Ironically, at the same time that these images minimizing the woman's body were being circulated, women's reproductive function took on paramount importance in both medicine and politics through issues such as abortion, birth control, sterilization, and hormone replacement therapy. And here it is. The study was just published in Nature, an artificial womb, which has grown a mouse embryo for about half of its natural gestation period, complete with beating heart cells, a head, and limb buds. As we've discussed already, being seen predominantly as a reproductive body with different hormonal cycles and states has kept women out of medical trials. Furthermore, merely having a uterus with childbearing potential treats every woman like a walking womb, even if they don't want to have children, can't have children, or are not currently pregnant. They're still kept out of drug studies. Concerns about risk to the fetus are understandable, and we certainly want to avoid tragedies like the thalidomide and DES crises of the 50s and 60s. But as Maya Dusenberry points out in her book, Doing Harm, there's a tendency within medicine to focus on the potential dangers of treatment to the fetus over the benefits of the treatment to the mother. There are about 400,000 women each year who become pregnant and also have significant medical illnesses. According to the CDC, 90% of them take some form of medication and 70% a prescription medication while pregnant. But these drugs have unknown safety and efficacy because they've never been tested on pregnant women. This leaves the woman and sometimes her fetus either vulnerable to the untreated condition or in an uncontrolled experiment every time they take a medication. Again, to quote Dusenberry, we learn on the backs of pregnant women while pretending we don't experiment on pregnant women. In addition to determining a woman's healthcare, this framing of the female body as a reproductive body has had a profound effects on every aspect of her life, social, political, economic, and more. In a way, it's created a sort of anatomical determinism that has shaped the rest of our human experience. I'd now like to turn to the theme of the anatomical woman as a sexual body. The focus on women's reproductive capacity went hand in hand with looking at her as a sexual body. But instead of seeing her as a sexual subject with structures and systems that are that enable her own sexual pleasure, her body was more often illustrated as a sexual object available for visual consumption by others. This is Albrecht Dürer's Draftsman drawing a nude, and in it you see on the right a male artist drawing a female model through a transparent grid that helps him assess the foreshortening of her body. He's the active analytic participant, and he exists in the world of science, structure, and order. She, however, in contrast, is sensuously lying on cushions, her eyes closed, while passively offering herself to his gaze. The inclusion of the tall obelisk between his arms, the sword at his waist, and the pen that he's about to dip into ink aren't exactly subtle conclusions of what he's thinking. What's striking about this image is that their positioning and the subject-object relationship are very similar to that of a gynecological exam. Indeed, there is an eroticism to anatomy, As medical historian Michael Sopal has pointed out, dissection has often been regarded as a kind of undressing of the body or a rape of the grave. It's also provided a legitimate domain in which male and female genitals could receive detailed representation. As he describes, its close proximity to pornography gave it a glow and a tingle. A fascinating Renaissance example of this is shown here. It's Charles de Etienne's dissection of the human body. While he did document some very important medical discoveries, and he was the first to identify, draw, and label the clitoris as a distinct member, you can also see that his artistry was nowhere on par with Vesalius's. But as the saying goes, sex sells, and Etienne was very interested in sex. For his anatomical women, he borrowed a series of popular images, pornographic images, from Jacopo Cariglia's erotic book, The Loves of the Gods. For the most part, they're depicted in bedrooms, swooning in ecstasy. Etienne eliminated the male sexual partners and inserted illustrations of reproductive anatomy onto the female figures. The sense of sex lingered, however, and it appealed to a wide audience, both medical and non-medical. In the image on the left, it's one of the only ones where she's outside, and the voyeuristic experience of the reader is mirrored by that curious man in the upper left corner who's standing on a balcony and readjusting his glasses to get a better view. On the right, I find it particularly incongruous because she's pleasantly smiling as she's pointing to a very torturous looking speculum on the floor. Here again is Gautier de Agauty, who seems to be reveling in the grotesque eroticism of the dissected body. While this could be construed as a birthing pose, with the infant shown already engaged in the pelvis, it really feels like she's more ready for a sexual encounter with the viewer. Taking another 200-year leap, this is a medical textbook entitled The Anatomical Basis of Medical Practice by Frederick Becker. It's from 1971. In it, he uses photographs of pinup girls and Playboy-style nudes as the anatomical models, along with sexually suggestive comments about women. A boycott of the text was organized by Dr. Estelle Raimi, a professor at Georgetown Medical School and president of the Association of Women in Science, who denounced the book as, quote, an obscene denigration of women and indeed the men practicing medicine. It was withdrawn from the market, to which the authors claimed they were victims of a feminist witch hunt for their witty, engaging, and funny little book. The corresponding images of men are totally different. They're non-sexual and focused on the actual part of the body you're studying. Perhaps the most striking and obvious sexual representations of women have been the 3D models. This is in part due to the uncanniness of their physicality, which makes them feel strangely familiar in ways that are unsettling. The 18th century saw not only the rise of obstetrical mannequins, but also of these wax models, also called wax Venuses. During this era of enlightenment, the international elite would go on the grand tour of Europe in the name of education and refinement. And an essential part of that tour were visiting the cabinets of curiosities and wax models in cities throughout Europe. The centerpiece of any good collection was the life-size pregnant Venus. But it wasn't just her pregnant womb that was of interest. It was her languid, sensual, and uncanny embodiment of both beauty and perfection. These models existed at the intersection of passive death and sexual activity. In addition to having, as you can see, accurately colored organs that could be touched and removed and explored, the Venuses had fine clothes, jewels, bed cushions, and flowing hair. While on tour, people would also see the other famous European Venuses in museums, which shared similar poses, attributes, and erotic content. This is another sleeping Venus by Pierre Spitzner from the mid-19th century that was displayed at a museum in Paris. Despite having an abdominal incision and a mechanism that replicated breath, I find this is hardly an anatomical model. She's the embodiment of Victorian modesty in her immaculate white lace gown that covers her entire body. During this era, even medical exams were often performed by doctors who reached up under the clothing of women so as not to compromise that modesty. I also find the title Sleeping Venus to be very complicated. She's neither sleeping nor in the sexually available posture that most Venuses were in. She is, however, tied up and looks in disbelief as two sets of disembodied male hands pull her apart. This feels to me more like Gothic terror and sexual violence. And while the gown may cover her genitals in the Victorian tradition, the incision looks more like an externalized, magnified vagina than it does an operation. If it's at all an anatomical model, it's because the dissection itself has become the female sexual organs. A century later, another female mannequin was developed that's responsible for saving millions of lives. This is Resusci Annie, also known as CPR Annie, or the most kissed face of all time. She was developed in the 1960s by a toy maker and 2 physicians, and is still in production today by the Leonardo Medical Company. When designing her face, they decided to use a famous death mask of an unidentified woman who drowned in the Seine in the 1880s. It was considered the ideal of beauty and was popular for Parisian artists and bohemians to have them in their homes. The designers of the CPR doll felt it was important that the model be female, but also a kissable female, suspecting that men would be reluctant to practice CPR on a male doll's lips. Thus, implicit in these origins of this life-saving medical model is the notion that the female body is an acceptable passive recipient of intimate contact, whereas the male body is neither passive nor a sexual object. Nevertheless, if you've ever done a CPR training class, you probably noticed that the model doesn't look like CPR Annie. It looks more like the torso of a man or a baby. While the makers thought the original model would only be acceptable as kissable, as a widely used medical tool, once again, the female body transformed into the universal male. And in case you're not sure if that torso is really male, here are examples from another website where they're named Braden, Ambuman, Hal, Brad, and other names. There are a few other female CPR models on the market. This is CPR Arlene, who is oddly wearing lipstick. And these here are some of the plastinated real human bodies from Gunter von Hagen's famous exhibit, Body Worlds. It's one of the most popular exhibits of all time. It has traveled to many countries, been seen by millions of people, and has been touted as the modern revival of public anatomy. Von Hagen's process involves replicating the fluids and some of the tissues of the various cadavers by a plastic polymer that he invented. He calls the process of putting the plastic polymer forced impregnation. While most of the whole body plastinates are male bodies, they're generally engaged in athletic or mental activities such as basketball, tennis, chess, or poker. He was criticized for the discrepancy between the number of male and female bodies in his show, but he claimed that he was, quote, being sensitive to perceived community concerns and did not want to appear voyeuristic in revealing too many female bodies. These are some of his female bodies. If he did not want to appear voyeuristic, he clearly missed the mark. Almost all of his women are in highly sexualized cliched poses, whether engaged in activities such as ballet, yoga, or figure skating, or seductively revealing their pregnancy. So I'm now going to present a few examples of how sexualizing the female body also made things like her breasts and genitals excitingly taboo, and as a result, many have felt the need to cover or blur them out. The National Library of Medicine has 2 volumes of this book, Hilkiah Crook's description of the body of man, that illustrate this point. In 1615, Crook published the first comprehensive book on anatomy in English in London. In it, he borrows images from other anatomists, as you can see on the right, that's from Vesalius, and he used it to show the female urogenital anatomy. The Bishop of London, however, objected to the book's text and illustrations, especially, quote, the natural parts belonging to generation, because he considered them indecent. Furthermore, the College of Physicians criticized the use of vernacular English to describe the female parts. When the second edition came out in 1631, the vaginal cleft that you can see on the left has been removed, as you can see on the right. It is just a blank space with the letter Y over it. Despite being a natural part of the female anatomy, it was deemed sexual and indecent, and therefore was erased. A modern example of this framing was in the news last year. The National Archives in Washington, D.C. had an exhibit in 2020 to celebrate the centennial of women's suffrage. At the entrance to the exhibit, they had a photograph from the 2017 Women's March in D.C. It was not the original image, however. They had blurred out protest posters that criticized both President Trump or that referred to female genitalia. This photo is technically not in their collection, so it's not an alteration of an archived work, but it received criticism nonetheless. They apologized, and they stated that they had not wanted to appear partisan and had blurred out the words vagina and pussy because the museum hosts students and it could be perceived as inappropriate. Vagina, however, is an actual biological word, anatomical word used in science class, but because of this hypersexualization of the female body, it was seen as inappropriate. While the slang term is not scientific, the reason it was on the protest poster was because it was quoting the president. Erasing women's voices and bodies next to a poster that says rightfully hers is quite ironic. Another contemporary example that's making a lot of headlines these days is the Free the Nipple movement. In visual media, the female nipple must be covered, not the breast tissue, just the nipple, but a male nipple does not. Many activists and celebrities have taken this cause up on social media in protests, and there's even been a film about it. The picture on the bottom left is from the film. As a figurative artist, this poses problems. I personally have been censored for having my work up, even though they were clearly identified as paintings. I'd now like to investigate another theme within this history of women's anatomy, the women's body as a monstrous body. Thus far, we've seen the reproductive and sexual body, usually pure, young, maternal, available, and passive. But what about women who didn't fit into those categories? What about women whose bodies were different or couldn't be controlled? In such instances, the female body was illustrated as a transgressive or monstrous body. One way that women did not fit into the acceptable stereotype of normal woman was through advanced or excess age. It's as if the only other option to being youthful, fertile, and pure is either being quite ghastly or not shown at all. Furthermore, as seen in these two images from the 17th and 18th centuries, a defunct reproductive system runs the risk of turning into massively deadly tumors. Everything here feels exaggerated, both the tumors and the saggy wretchedness of the women. In this interesting series of flap anatomies from 1680 to 90, entitled The Four Seasons of Humanity, which are at Duke University, you can follow a man and woman through their seasons of their life. The two images are from summer and autumn and reveal a woman and man in their youthful prime. She's increasingly fertile, and in his case, he's increasingly erect. And they're both standing in lush, beautiful landscapes as they hold up flasks of various humors. In winter, however, you can see that the woman is clearly done. She's holding her sack of mortality and dumping out her flask of melancholia. She literally steps into a grave littered with bones and dead things. In her old age, she appears to have lost both her skin and her hope. The man, however, on the left, he's lost some of his hair, but he's still standing perkily in the landscape amidst the lush plants, looking at a working man and a family scene in the background, holding his flask up high. Another example, in the late 1980s, the National Library of Medicine embarked on a massive project to create the most extensive anatomical record in history, the Visible Human Project. They wanted to provide highly detailed digital data sets of real human anatomy that they could correspond to clinical CT and MRI scans. In doing so, they hoped to combine the anatomical artistry of the past with contemporary 3D modeling computer software to reconstruct any aspect of the human body. Using a male and female cadaver, they scanned the body using CT and MRI, then froze the bodies in blue gelatin, cut extremely thin cross sections from head to toe, took digital pictures, photographs at each level. And now these digital images, known as the data set, can be reassembled, navigated, and manipulated using software programs. As you can see, some can be animated and correlated with CT or MRI, as you see in the bottom right from that section. I want to turn my attention, however, to some of the gender issues that arose in the course of the Visible Human Project. Both bodies were acquired through donations, and they met bioethical standards of informed consent. The man was the 39-year-old convict executed by lethal injection who had donated his body prior to death. The woman was a 59-year-old Maryland housewife who died of cardiovascular disease and was donated by her husband. His body was obtained first, and so he was processed first into just under 2,000 high-resolution images. Of note, there were some abnormalities in his body. He only had one testicle. He was missing his appendix as well as several teeth, and his tissue had deteriorated at the lethal injection site. There were also some issues with the freezing of his body and processing. His brain was a little swollen, his inner ear ossicles were lost, and his arms had been cut at slightly the wrong angle. The woman, on the other hand, was done later, and as a result, they were able to do much thinner slices, resulting in about 5,000 high-resolution images, giving her a far more detailed digital body. While the data sets themselves are without text or interpretation, the bodies ended up carrying a lot of cultural baggage. Perhaps the most common label that was applied to them was the original virtual couple, a digital Adam and Eve in the cyberspace Garden of Eden. As such, all of the morals, the binary gender coding, and the hierarchies that were applied to the first Christian couple were reapplied here. The particular narrative of the virtual man was one of redemption and resurrection. He had been a convicted murderer, but now he was seen as an internet angel, a hero, a Jesus figure, even a champion sportsman. The woman, however, continued to be known as a Maryland housewife, the reproductive other who, like Eve, came later to be his companion. While the Visible Human Project may be the most contemporary form of anatomical imaging, it carries on many of the traditions of historical anatomy. Here again, the male, despite missing some body parts, being distorted and containing less information, became the anatomical norm. His body has been used in more text, reconstructions, 3D and animated models. She has been treated as his reproductive adjunct, serving mostly for visual reality training in gynecology. But her minimization, unfortunately, went even further than that, because her postmenopausal body is seen as deviating from the female norm and therefore made her less useful. She didn't fit into the family picture of a young, reproductively viable unit. As a result, a new woman's being prepared, the Stanford visible female, who is described as normal and of childbearing age. As these examples have illustrated, the non-functioning womb rendered the female body either monstrous or insignificant. In contrast, however, a hyper-functioning womb or any form of female excess also created problems. Until the 1930s, very little was known about female reproduction, and as a result, the uterus was the embodiment of anything that could go wrong with human development. These images are by Ambroise Paré, a 16th century French surgeon who was praised for his wartime treatments and advances in surgery. He was also considered to be the first physician to provide organized midwife training in a hospital setting. In his writing about obstetrics, he put forth this view that the female body was incomplete and defective, that menstruation was a symptom of dysfunction, and that women were unstable because of their uteri. His chapter on generation was followed by a chapter on monstrosities, which included anything from the commonplace, such as twins, to fantastical beasts that he claims to have seen or heard of through tales passed down through history. One such monstrosity was a multiple birth. On the left is a poor woman holding up her 20 fetuses with a hula hoop. On the right, you see the complications of pregnancy, including breech presentations, a set of twins, and on the bottom left, a hermaphrodite. Indeed, there was a fear of such births because of the potential dangers to both the mother and the child at delivery. But there were also prevalent beliefs going back to the ancient times as well as the Bible that multiple births were unnatural and a sign of physical illness. Albertus Magnus argued that multiples were a sign of excessive maternal sexual pleasure and proof of their sexual insatiability. Here are more examples of intersex presentations by Paré, including an intersex chimera. As I mentioned earlier, the universal baby, like the universal human, was male. But this is the one place that I found an abundance of females. He provides several examples of female conjoined twins, one of which has a caption that reads, quote, "Example of the too great quantity of femaleness." While it is true that female conjoined twins are more likely to be born alive and survive, he seems to also have a penchant, as you see on the right, for pointing out unusual female presentations, such as a girl who was born without a head. He also illustrated a woman fully covered in hair next to a child of color. Basically, any physical presentation that wasn't a perfectly formed white male European singleton was considered the other, or in Paré's words, a monstrosity. This particular image brings up another important issue. It wasn't just women's wombs that were scary, it was also her mind. The caption seen at top in French reads, "Figure of a girl covered in hair and a black child made by the imagination." The belief that a woman's imagination could alter her pregnancy goes all the way back to Hippocrates. But this particular image, in which the hairy woman and black child were seen together, also served as a model for another book that continued to be published into the 20th century. The image on the right is from Aristotle's masterpiece, which is not written by Aristotle, nor is it really a masterpiece, but it was published in London, 1684. The frontispiece, as you can see, was taken directly from Paré, and below it, it says, the effigies of a male hairy and an infant that was black by the imagination of their parents. In the text of the book, Pseudo-Aristotle goes on to explain that the mother of the hairy woman had seen the image of St. John covered in animal skins during copulation, and the mother of the black child was thinking about Ethiopia at the same time. This bizarre little book about the mysteries of sex, women's bodies, and birth is probably the most widely printed book on a medical subject in both the 18th and early 19th centuries. Its third version from 1710 was still printed and sold to a general audience in the 1930s. One of the most interesting things to track in this series is how the frontispiece changes over time. Gradually, they become less about the power of the female imagination and more about middle-class, white, proper, domestic femininity and motherhood. You can see here from these two versions, you see the woman on the left, just a nude woman, next to a scene of a marriage. And on the right, you see her in the office with a sheer covering next to a scene of maternity. This on the left is an image from 1831 from Aristotle's masterpiece. As you can see here, the frontispiece is now Chang and Eng bunker. Chang and Eng were the most famous conjoined twins of the early 19th century, who made money touring Europe and America and also putting them on display as curiosities. They did this as well with P.T. Barnum. They also allowed doctors to examine them, thus providing much of the early documented observations of conjoined twins by physicians. This new image that we see here, it continues the tradition of the book's preoccupation with both race and physical anomalies, here united in one real-world famous example. While Chang and Eng may be the most famous examples of what historian Rosemary Garland Thompson calls extraordinary bodies, there were several other people who became world famous as part of the 19th century touring cabinets of curiosities, more commonly called freak shows or the circus. These spectacles went hand in hand with traveling anatomy exhibits, as you see in the middle, as well as the medical museums that arose both in Europe and America. Central to these spectacles was the opportunity to witness firsthand variable human anatomy, whether conjoined twins, hairy women, people from other cultures and non-white races, as well as any physical trait, disease, or body alteration that made you different. The sexual and reproductive organs of females, particularly non-white females, and intersex bodies were very popular, as were the displays of Venuses, both wax and living. There was a symbiotic relationship between the showman and the scientist. Doctors would legitimate the curiosities by offering testimonials of authenticity, and the showman would offer publicity as well as clout to the doctors. Deceased sideshow performers were often sold to doctors as anatomical specimens for further study. Here's an interesting story that I now want to explain. This is Millie Christine McCoy. They were contemporaries of Chang and Eng, and they achieved much the same level of fame and financial success during their lifetime, but they've received much less historical attention. They were born in 1851 as slaves in North Carolina and sold 3 times before the age of 6. They're fused at the pelvis and otherwise healthy, but they were unable to do slave work, but were deemed valuable as a spectacle. They were taught to read, write, sing, and dance, play the piano, and they learned 5 languages. They toured and were exhibited in both the US and Europe, and they were sometimes billed, as you can see on the left, as the African twins, and at others on the right, 2-headed nightingale. Disability scholars, one Robert Bogdan, classified most sideshow performances in 2 categories: the exotic mode, in which they were advertised as freakish savages because of their non-white status, or the aggrandized mode, in which they were billed as highly educated, cultured, and even aristocratic. You can see that Millie Christine McCoy were billed as both. In 1869, the twins published an autobiography, The History and Medical Description of a Two-Headed Girl, in which they provided a generally positive account of their lives and the family that owned them, as well as an extensive list of the medical testimonies verifying their authenticity. While this may have been their public narrative, it's unclear how much of an independent, autonomous voice they were able to have, given that they were teenagers, enslaved, conjoined, and enfreaked, which is a term used to describe the process of social control in which different bodies are stylized, dehumanized, and marketed. In fact, in 2007, a letter was found at the National Archives that revealed another side to this story. In 1866, the McCoys' parents wrote to the Freedmen's Bureau, requesting their assistance in recovering their daughters from the Smiths, who, despite the Emancipation Proclamation, had kept the girls in their service under promises and threats, and currently had them on exhibition at Barnum's Museum in New York City. While there are many issues to discuss here, I do want to focus on their medical experience. As previously noted, they had to endure multiple physical examinations from birth until the age of 14, and they outline some of them here. In their reports, physicians were fixated on debating the exact configuration of the twins' genitalia. They couched it as scientific curiosity, but both the physicians and the public at large shared a voyeuristic erotic obsession with their ambiguous sexual potential, reproductive capacity, and marriage potential, all of which challenged gender norms. Following the Emancipation Proclamation when they were 14, the twins decided that they would not have any further medical exams, which infuriated physicians throughout Europe and the US. They were accused of being frauds, despite the fact of all the past testimonials. When the twins fell sick with a severe abscess at the age of 20, doctors actually expressed joy and gratitude that they needed to seek medical care so they could be re-examined. The examining physician was Dr. Pancoast, the same doctor who performed Chang and Eng's autopsy. He pressured the McCoys to let him take a photograph of them, partially unclothed so you could see the point of bodily connection. He was proud of himself that through earnest entreaty, he convinced them to take this photo, and he commented on both their modesty and their displeasure. Looking at their facial features, I don't really see modesty, but I do see disappointment, anger, and defiance. A report of his extensive examination, this photograph, and 2 detailed illustrations that he had made of their vulva and splayed lower legs were published in the Photographic Review of Medicine and Surgery in 1871. What was not included in this report was any mention of how or even if the abscess was treated, the whole reason that they had sought medical care. I've chosen here to cover their bodies since it's clear that their consent was coerced, and they were never informed of the illustrations that were being made. Furthermore, neither the photos nor the sketches addressed the medical issue that was being sought. I also want to point out how these images were subsequently altered. The bottom image is from Dr. George Fisher's 1889 entry on teratology in a reference handbook that's at the National Library of Medicine that cites Pancoast's article as the source. But as you can see here, he's changed the face of Millie to soften her expression and divert her defiant gaze. In doing so, he's negated her power of her gaze and her personal experience. It repositions her as a passive anatomical object available for study, rather than the active subject challenging that authority. If you compare Millie Christine to Daisy and Violet Hilton, who appeared a little bit later, they were in sideshow, vaudeville, and burlesque acts, as well as films. There was a similar voyeuristic obsession and sexualization of these twins, but the Hiltons did not suffer the same medical scrutiny, nor were any sources circulated that described their genitalia. Furthermore, their legacies have been totally different. Whereas Millie Christine have been largely forgotten, the Hilton sisters have been the subject of 2 musicals, you may have heard of Sideshow, as well as films about their lives. Part of this increased medical and societal fixation with McCoy's sexual anatomy had to do with the fact that in the 19th century, Black female sexuality was pathologized and seen as a threat to white women's purity and morality. In the half century before their birth, one of the most famous phenomenon performers in the world was a woman from South Africa called Sarah Bartman, also known as the Hottentot Venus. That was her stage name. Both in life and death, she was stylized, put on display, and exploited for her African heritage and physical differences. In the 1819 French Dictionary of Medical Sciences, a scientist wrote that Black women had overdeveloped sexual organs that caused their lasciviousness and primitive sexuality. The Hottentots were seen as the epitome of these traits due to a condition that caused increased fat deposition in their buttocks, as well as enlarged labia. Thus, by highlighting what they saw as her excesses, racial, genital, and sexual, Europeans created another type of monstrous woman. This image is from the 2010 movie Black Venus, which tells the story of Sarah Bartman's life. When she died in Paris at age 26 from vague causes, her body, considered a specimen of special scientific interest, went into the possession of the naturalist Georges Cuvier. He made a plaster cast of her body, a copy of which is shown here in the movie, and then he dissected her body. He preserved her skeleton, pickled both her genitals and her brain in jars, and put them all on display next to her body cast at Paris's Museum of Man. They remained on public display until 1974. The difference in how medical ethics and norms were applied to Black versus white female bodies is apparent here. Sarah Bartman's body, like that of Millie Christine, was deemed different and powerless, and therefore dissected, anatomized, and passed around in jars without her consent. In 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa and requested that her remains and body cast be returned for burial in her home country. But it wasn't until 2002 that the French government agreed. 192 years later, after she left for Europe, she was buried in the Eastern Cape province. To conclude, I want to juxtapose this earlier image of the creation of Eve and the structure of man with one that I found after a long day of research at the National Library of Medicine. I'd spent the day looking at every copy of Gray's Anatomy that they have from 1858 to the present, and I'm not going to lie, it was incredibly tedious. But while some updates had been made over time that reflected medical and technological advances, not much had changed in terms of sex and gender representation. But the very last one that I saw, that I picked up, was the 2020 Gray's Anatomy for Students, shown at the right, and the very first image I saw is here. In the thoracic section, they even used a female torso to demonstrate cardiac anatomy. Although the impact of anatomical history on the female body is still being felt, things are starting to change. Bodies that were once framed as the other, different, or symbolic of societal agendas are now being illustrated, embraced and illustrated as normative, scientifically significant bodies. Furthermore, the conversation of the complex spectrum of sex and gender has moved into the mainstream. Both society and medicine are paying more attention to the stories and experiences of those whose physical presentation and identities are along a spectrum and are also individualized. Thank you, and now I'm happy to take any questions.
Dr. Hill-Edgar, fantastic talk. Thank you very, very much. Really well done. Thank you. We have time for just a couple of questions. For those who are watching remotely, there is a live feedback link just under the video, and you can use that to send a question which will arrive directly in my email. Or if you're on Twitter following us, you can direct message me. I'm at Jeffrey S. Resnick. One of our viewers writes, thank you for this wonderful talk. You noted that the, quote, global gender gap would take about 99 years to close. And you cited some examples of how American medicine is working to close the gap. But closing the global gap requires global effort. How widespread is the acknowledgement of the gender gap around the world? And are there parallel efforts to close it?
Well, there are some places, England, for example, is also looking into this, and many of the studies that I cited were there. And France and Europe, they're also looking more into it. But obviously, the global gender gap encompasses a lot more than just sort of medical education. We're also looking at economic situation of women, and there's obviously in a lot of other countries, there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of representation of women, education of women, and then the medical treatment of women. So probably, you know, depending on how we want to look at it in terms of what's happening in America versus its relationship to the entire world, I do think there are some advances taking place here. I mean, at least we have the recognition of NIH that these things have to be addressed, and some laws that are being passed to do that. We're also sort of the leading force in medicine in this country. So I do hope and expect that might be less if you're just looking at America specifically. But there is, I think that the feeling is until we improve the situation for women all around the world, we can't just focus on one country. We have to lift everyone up at the same time. And there are things that we know here that have to do with reproduction as well as just kind of general healthcare that some places, believe it or not, actually have earlier access to just because of some of our more restrictive laws.
Thank you. Another viewer writes, absolutely remarkable. Thank you so much. The Gates Foundation should be interested to pick up some of your findings and recommendations. No question there, but a wonderful comment with credit to your wonderful research. Someone writes, tell us about your future plans for your research. Do you have any plans to publish aspects of what you presented this afternoon?
Yes, in fact, I have lots of plans. My research is not done. You know, with COVID, I haven't been able to go back into the library for a long time. So there's so many things still at the National Library of Medicine that I'm dying to go back to see, as well as some other institutions. I just, you know, I know this was a very long and detailed presentation, but the material I have is actually multifold, greater than this. I have so many other stories and so many other topics that I would have loved to include had I had more time. So I plan to write a book about this. That's already in the works, and it's going to be much more extensive than what I presented here today. But I also, one of my major goals, being an artist, I love the tangible aspect of these works. And, you know, you can see them on a little image on a computer screen, but they certainly don't compare to the act of holding something in your hands or encountering it right in front of you. As I mentioned at the beginning, the context matters. I think seeing these works, whether they're in a book or their size or just the craftsmanship in person, is so very important to appreciating what they are, that I would very much like to put together an exhibition. So one of my main goals that I'd like to do sooner rather than later is pull together all of these works. You know, it's going to take a lot of effort and sort of coordinated support from the people who have these things. Luckily, the National Library of Medicine has so many of them. But I would very much like to see an exhibition, because I think people should see these things together in person in their sort of original format.
Thank you. Another of our viewers writes, absolutely fabulous talk. And this viewer has a question. Do you think the inclusion of the intersex cell as 1/7 demonstrates that earlier anatomists were more aware of intersex individuals?
So one of the things I appreciated about this project was how much more I saw examples of intersex awareness than you do right now in medicine. And so I think, you know, what's remarkable to me is till a certain point in history, intersex individuals were seen as a fact of life. They existed. And then I think, you know, as you get to where I was showing Paré, and there was sort of this, he really put it more in terms of the monstrous. And then with the whole 19th century cabinet of curiosities and freak shows, I think as a culture, we started redefining the other and putting the other in a separate sphere. And certainly other cultures have terms for intersex along a spectrum as well that's far more diverse than what we have. But I do think a lot of it has to do with the transition that happened sort of in the 19th century, really. And then with, if you look to the 20th century, which I unfortunately didn't have time to talk about, it's quite known within medicine that children are born with either intersex or ambiguous genitalia. And there are surgical procedures that have been done, you know, for years to deal with that. But part of what we've done in this country was assume that you had to be assigned at birth a binary, so either male or female, and construct your anatomy accordingly, and then be raised according to that gender. So I do think in the last century, there's been some effort to sort of eliminate this sort of appearance of intersex, even though there's multiple health, you know, issues and internal organs that you can't always affect. So, excuse me. Anyway, but then what I would say is I'm very encouraged by the last few decades where there's so much more awareness of intersex individuals. And those surgeries that have been around for a while are now part of the transsexual surgical process. Both the surgeries and the hormones that were used to sort of eliminate the intersex towards the binary, we're now looking to some of those to really explore what I see as the bigger spectrum of sex and gender across the board. And I think we have a much better understanding in this day and age of how to sort of talk to patients, understand patients, and treat patients who have gender or sex issues.
Thank you. So we've come to the end of our time together this afternoon, but by way of thanking you, I'd like to read a message that was sent by another one of our viewers this afternoon. Thank you for shining a light on female representation and for demonstrating how culture and health intersect. Bravo. Looking forward to hearing more and to follow you as this important research continues. So this individual could not have said it better, and I'm not going to say it better. It's outstanding, and my colleagues and I at the National Library of Medicine look forward to welcoming you back in due course, and we wish you every continued success in this fantastic research tour de force that you offered us this afternoon. Thank you for preparing it and presenting it, and we look forward to keeping in touch. And best to you and your family.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.